Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have with us an expert panel who over the next hour will help us understand how the COVID-19 pandemic has transformed the world as we know it with respect to health and human rights. And importantly, what we're learning from this transformational moment that we can harness as lessons going forward, all with an eye toward building more equal and more just societies. I'm Don McKay. I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Human Rights, PHR. We began as a PHR series on the conversations around COVID's implications early on, back in March of the pandemic. But it's grown into now a weekly series that brings expert voices together to discuss the most timely health and human rights issues that we're confronting. And today's conversation is the 25th in PHR series. We have over 600 people live with us today to hear from experts in medicine, public health, social epidemiology, and economics and innovation. And I'm really pleased to welcome our panel today. This is a conversation that I've been looking forward to since Jonathan Cohen and I discussed the subject many weeks ago, and it's really sorely needed. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Jonathan Cohen, who will be co-moderating our panel with Dr. May van Schalkwyk, I'm sorry. And what I know is going to be an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. Jonathan's the director of Open Society Foundation's Public Health Program, where he oversees grant making and advocacy to improve social inclusion in public health policy and practice. And he formerly served as a member and co-chair of the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS Reference Group on HIV and AIDS and human rights. And our other co-moderator, Dr. May van Schalkwyk, is a public health doctor and National Institute for Health Research doctoral fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she's built a career researching the corporate and political determinants of health and inequities, trade and health, and systems in government. So Jonathan and May, thank you so much for being with us today. And I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, many thanks, Donna. And on behalf of Jonathan and myself, a very special thanks to Physicians for Human Rights for giving us the opportunity to hold this webinar as part of their impactful seminar series covering COVID-19. And Jonathan and I would also very much like to thank Professor Martin McKee for helping us organize today's discussion and for joining us today. The topic of transformational change is one that will define 2020 and the years to come. And the COVID-19 pandemic has led to over 1 million deaths and has exposed and deepened intolerable inequities in our society that for too long have gone ignored. The pandemic has changed our ways of living the world over, and we will have to start to reconsider fundamentals of our economic, social, and political life. But the pandemic has also been accompanied by a profound sense of hope and opportunity for radical change in the pursuit of a better world. And indeed, some radical changes are already being consciously pursued. But what does a better world look like? Who needs to change and how? Who should decide? How do we overcome those who will resist change so that this opportunity is not lost? In short, how can we make sure that everyone and the planet we live on benefit from change? So we'll be discussing some of these questions today. We're delighted to have this esteemed panel to share their thoughts with us. And I'll now turn over to Jonathan to introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll pass over to them to share their perspectives and open up the discussion.
Thank you, May, and thank you, Physicians for Human Rights. I remember, as I'm sure many of you do, how taken so many of us were when the novelist Arundhati Roy described COVID-19 as a portal and a gateway from one world to the next. Many of us quickly began defining the world beyond the portal in inspiring ways, from universal health care to the closure of prisons and institutions to debt relief for low-income countries. Yet it soon became clear that COVID-19 would only be as much of a portal as we made it. Because indeed, for every transformation inspired by the pandemic, there are vested interests working to make sure that these transformations do not have their intended effects. And moreover, relying on increasing myths and misinformation about public health and its social, economic, and political determinants. I think what thrills us about today's panel is that each of our speakers are either proposing concrete transformations to come out of the pandemic or are applying themselves to the question of what makes transformation possible. Each in their own way, they all seem to understand that transformation is not simply something to be imagined and dreamt and hoped for, but rather something to be consciously designed and studied. And our first speaker is such an excellent example of this, having called as early as April for a Marshall Plan for health to prioritize the common good for good coming out of the pandemic. He is Dr. Sandro Galea, Dean and Robert A. Knox Professor at Boston University School of Public Health, Chair of the Board of the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health, and past President of the Society for Epidemiologic Research and the Interdisciplinary Association for Population Science, and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. Dr. Galea, we're so thrilled to have you with us, and please start us off.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, May, and thank you, Donna. And thank you to Physicians for Human Rights for hosting this. It's really an honor to be here with Professors Mazzucato and Krieger. It's really a privilege to be here as part of this panel. Thank you for the charge that really about social transformation, how we can create a better world. So I thought I would organize my thoughts in a couple of ways. I thought I would start off by asking what is the world that needs to be transformed. I actually think that before we even get into the question of how do we transform the world, I do think it's helpful to take a step back and say, what's the world that needs to be transformed? Because it is important to remember, particularly I think in heated times when we are talking a lot about transformation, that there is much about the world that is good, and there's much about the world that is better than it's ever been. And I realize whenever I do a talk about something like this, and I start this way, I disappoint people because we are eager to say, what can we do better? But I think it's important to say there are a lot of things that are better now than they ever have been. Far fewer children die due to poverty than they ever have. Far fewer mothers die in childbirth. Across the world, many more people, not everybody, can vote and be a part of participatory democracy. Our political systems function better than they ever have in the past. None of that says that we are anywhere near as good as can be, but I think it does say that there is much that we have achieved together over the past centuries, and that there is much that is worth preserving. It also reminds us that change, real transformative change, happens slowly. That a lot of these things that I've listed, and I could go on, have actually been achieved over the course of decades and of centuries. And I think part of the work of transformation is having the wisdom to balance what it is that needs to be changed slowly, and when it is that there is a moment where change can accelerate for the betterment of many. So point A is I wanted to start off by saying, the world is doing a lot of things well, and there are a lot of things that we are doing much better than we were doing in 1980, 1960, 1940, 1920, 1880. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. That's point A. The second point then is, okay, well, having said that, what is COVID, because this is framed in the context of COVID, teaching us about the need for transformation? So at some level, COVID did not tell us anything new. At some level, if you read the work of actually many of the panelists who are on this panel, you'll see that the issues that COVID has surfaced, we've known about and have been in our consciousness for years and for decades. We have known for years and for decades that we are underinvesting in the conditions that make people healthy. We have known for years, for decades, for a century, that large parts of the world, just taking a US focus for a second, are riven by deep forces of structural racism that create inequitable conditions that fundamentally limit our health achievement. We have known this. COVID makes this much more clear. And insofar as COVID makes it much more clear, it makes COVID a useful moment. And it's very difficult when you're dealing with something like COVID, when you say 1 million people have died, and to say, what is the usefulness of the moment? Because, and I want to be careful that that does not sound callous. I want to be careful to say, This is a very sad moment that has affected a lot of people's lives. But at the same time, part of our role, I think, as a human species to say, how do we learn from sadness to actually create a better world? So I think COVID has highlighted the underlying structural forces that both resulted in the undue burden of COVID on all populations and the underlying structural forces that resulted in the inequitable distribution of the burden of COVID. We realized through COVID that we as a world were unhealthier than we should have been. As a result, we suffered more from COVID, and we realized that that burden of poor health was unevenly distributed. In the American example, in particular, along racial lines, in other countries, along socioeconomic lines. I know in the UK, there's been some very good data about socioeconomic spectrum. None of this was surprising. And in fact, if you look in February and March, several people wrote that this was going to happen, and it did happen. And I think the COVID moment has now brought it to our attention. So insofar as COVID has elevated these issues to our attention, insofar as COVID has shown us that that we were not prepared, we had underinvested in the structures that create a healthy world, and we had underinvested them in such a way that it creates an unfair and inequitable burden. Now we come to the question of transformation. And Jonathan, you referred to a piece I had written about a Marshall Plan for Health. So then how do we go about creating the necessary transformation? You know, I think when you look at the transformation literature, and you look at transformation literature at small scale and large scale, there are two, I reduce the insights from that into two very fundamental elements. How do you transform anything? I think you transform anything through two ways. Number one is through changing the conversation. And number two is to changing the structures. And I tend to think that neither of these are necessary and neither of them are sufficient. So let me start with changing the conversation. Changing the conversation means understanding what it is that we want to do and recognizing that we actually want to act this way. In the context of health, which is sort of the pool that I swim in, it is understanding what causes health and recognizing that we want everybody to understand what causes health. Now, COVID was a health condition, obviously. And insofar as COVID was a health condition, it taught us that we as a world were willing to upend everything about our world because of a health condition. Now that's remarkable. It's hard to imagine something else that we would have upended our daily life for. And that tells us that we are willing to make efforts to really transform our world to improve health. So part A of transformation needs to be changing the conversation and saying that health should be central to how we think. Changing the conversation to say that we will not have health unless we have stable housing, unless we eliminate racism, unless we have gender equity, unless we have livable wages. Unless we have these conditions, we are not going to have health. And that conversation needs to change around that. One of the surveys which I was involved in, which I find most striking, is we asked people, rank a list of things about which of these affect health. And politics was ranked last by the general population. If I were to answer that survey, I would put politics as number one, because I think politics is the thing that affects our health the most. And changing the conversation means making sure that we understand that. So part A of transformation is changing the conversation. Part B is changing structures. Changing conversation in and of itself is empty unless we change structures. We are not going to reduce the effect of structural racism in the US context, just focus on the US context for a second, if we simply make sure that nobody discriminates interpersonally. If there remain structural barriers to people of different races in achieving fair housing, employment that's equitable, advancement in other ways, limit their access to care, we're not going to reduce the negative health impact of racism. Doesn't matter how much we change the conversation. So the structures have to change in parallel with the conversation. Saying that we all think that there should be livable wages is not going to achieve anything unless minimum wage laws also are changed in order to reflect that. So I think fundamentally, transformation needs to be changing the conversation and changing the structures. You know, there's a quote from Martin Luther King, which I like very much, and I do realize that Martin Luther King is overquoted, but since he's the most famous graduate of my current institution, I feel like it's fair that I quote him. And you know, Martin Luther King said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." And what he was calling for is a compassion that says we want to change the edifices. And I take that to mean we want to change the structures and we want to change the conversation. So to wrap up and just to stick with my time allocation, when I wrote this piece about saying we want a Marshall Plan for health, I was encouraging in it that we as a society learning from COVID now demand health. And we demand health and we demand a wholesale investment in changing the health conversation. And we demand health in all aspects of policymaking, in housing policymaking, in financial policymaking, in transportation policymaking, and the policymaking that's going to narrow racial gaps, it's going to narrow socioeconomic gaps, because fundamentally, the COVID moment teaches us that we will not be able to withstand the next pandemic if we continue to have these deep-seated socioeconomic and racial gaps. I will stop there to leave time for conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Galea, for getting us off to such a strong start. Professor Nancy Krieger, you've also been reflecting on the connections between COVID-19 and structural racism, as well as their connections to the climate crisis, to democratic governance, and to health justice. By way of introduction for our audience, Professor Nancy Krieger is a professor of social epidemiology in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. She also serves as the director of the Harvard School of Public Health Interdisciplinary Concentration on Women, Gender, and Health. We're so lucky to have you here to share your reflections. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and for all the work that Physicians for Human Rights has been doing for so long to make connections between health and human rights. Let me start by noting that I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, therefore I'm on Indigenous land, and I also want to respect critical Indigenous knowledge that informs my life and so many others for ways of thinking and ways of acting. Second, I want to really emphasize the point that COVID-19 in effect pulls the thread. It pulls the thread and reveals connections in our society that have long been known, long been lived, long been experienced, and reveals deep inequities in our society, but also incredible connections. The way the virus goes from person to person, from community to community, that shows the interconnection of people who are essential workers, even if they are undervalued and treated as disposable in the United States, with the people that they serve and work for, the people that they protect and act for as first responders. It shows the profound connections. It shows the profound connections between schools and neighborhoods and parents and families and intergenerational households. It shows the profound connections between housing and transportation. It shows the profound connections between the quality of the air that people breathe and if the fires are burning California. It shows the profound connections that we experience because we live embodied. We live embodied and our bodies integrate every day our societal and ecological context. That's what shows up in health inequities. And that's what shows up for health justice. And COVID is making all of that absolutely clear in a way that is very fast, because this is where a pandemic is different than many, and a pandemic of a fast acting virus where you're exposed. And if you do get sick, maybe 4 or 5 days later, you may actually start showing some symptoms. You also can be asymptomatic. We know that that's a huge part of the problem of what the transmission is. And if you end up being really ill, you may die quickly. The report that just came out from India had people dying within 5 days of hospitalization, much longer in the United States and other countries that have different healthcare systems with more access to ventilators, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to note that it's not new to have an epidemic and a pandemic both reveal the absolutely fraught relationships between different sectors of society and also show our fundamental connections as human beings. And it's not that it's new that public health understands this, because if you go to the early days of public health and it starts to come into its own as a discipline in the 1840s, guess what? It's the cholera epidemic of 1848. Guess what? There are the revolutions that go across Europe in 1848. There is the first public health acts in the United Kingdom that are critically put at that time to say the government has a responsibility, and raising the question, what is a government for? Is a government solely to protect the wealth of private property? Or does a government have obligations to start to create programs for the social good and social welfare? And that was the questions called then, and public health was pretty clear where it stood. And public health was also the nexus of the many movements of that time, not only about public health per se, but about abolition of slavery, about suffrage, about trade unions, about an 8-hour day. All those different campaigns came together at that time and shared concerns. It's why, among others, in the Silesia typhus epidemic that Virchow is so famous for in 1848, was saying that full and unlimited democracy is a precondition for having health for all people. And it was understanding that economics and democratic governance need to go together, as does economic democracy. So I think it's not unusual that in a fast, and cholera killed very fast back then. And there was not understanding of hydration, and there was not understanding that we have today because of the benefits of the science that has moved forward to understand how transmission actually occurs. So I think that it's really important to say that what we're seeing now with COVID-19, when it pulls the thread, it's showing that the reasons for the incredible distress of the incredible mounting economic inequities that have been growing, the extraordinary concentrations of private wealth that we have been seeing rising. 3 people in the United States own as much now as wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. The statistics go on, and the racial ethnic inequities in wealth are only growing, and that we also are seeing what happened with the summer, how this translates as well with the economic shutdowns, with the increased rise of police brutality, with the murders of George Floyd, with the response that just happened with the lack of justice for Breonna Taylor. The list goes on, and these are connected, and they're connected also to the question of the aggravation of health crises through climate change. And it was at demonstrations last summer when we were back having the first school strikes with Greta Thunberg. I went to a rally that was in Boston that had all these high school students there. And one of the common themes is said again and again is the politicians need to listen to the science. They need to listen to the evidence. But the thing is, and particularly in a US context, and it's particularly revealed by the events of this past week, that depends you have to ask, who are the politicians? And what I'm very aware of as a public health scientist who works endlessly with census data is the attempts to distort the census, to change who gets to vote or not vote, the reapportionment of districts, the gerrymandering, the attempts at voter suppression. All of this needs to be understood to understand even who the politicians are. And for scientists to act with an understanding and responsibility to actually producing the data we need, the census data we need for monitoring, for understanding who the population even is, but also how it ends up affecting allocation of resources, and that includes allocation of political power. And the debates are still underway about whether the US Census will be terminated early or not. And also the case that will go forward to the Supreme Court with a rushed hearing about the attempts to even count, who will be able to be counted for apportionment. Will people that are all people in the US, which is what the Constitution says, versus only people that count as quote unquote citizens. And always important to remember that the first franchise in this country was for white men with property who were free. So it's a real issue about who counts and so what happens now is that it's not for public health to invent the agenda of what needs to be done to go forward. It's recognizing that many social movements have stepped up and they have integrated platforms. So if you look at Black Lives Matter, if you look at the Sunrise Movement with young people working for climate change and climate justice. If you look at the Poor People's Campaign, they have integrated platforms that have health actually working all the way through them, because their platforms integrate concerns around health and justice the ways, again, our bodies do every day, every moment, every second. And I think that what needs to happen in public health is that reuniting to what our roots are in social justice with these kinds of movements. And we bring absolutely important technical knowledge to those discussions, but we are not the leaders per se. We can act in our many roles, sometimes as citizens, advocates in all kinds of different ways. But where we bring the particular expertise we have is about understanding etiology, is about being able to advise on the technical components and bring that vision to a vision that has a comprehensive view of social justice. What I also want to say is that in a time where the science really matters, it's not a matter of simply saying defend science, because it's also extremely important to remember that the people who are using sophisticated computer programs to gerrymander are using science. The people who are drilling wells and promulgating the use of fossil fuels, making all kinds of plastics, they're using science. So it's a question of which science, and that comes again to the questions of equity and justice. It's not simply science versus not science, even as there can, of course, be scientific denialism, but most of it is quite selective because much of it is also using science to aim for other goods. So I think that it's really critical to understand, again, the links that COVID shows us between people and what is also exacerbating because of the divisions and the economic conflicts and the societal and racial ethnic conflicts as well, and others could be listed. But it's also, I think, saying you can't ask why things are if you don't ask who is benefiting from how things are, not just who is being harmed. And that's where the questions of health justice come in most strongly. So I'd like to conclude by noting that I got involved in public health back in the 80s. That's when I started. And that's when HIV/AIDS was really beginning to show up. And I was in 1988 part of the National Health Commission of the National Rainbow Coalition that was advising Jesse Jackson in his presidential bid and wrote their AIDS platform. And AIDS was crucial in the uniting of the ideas of health and human rights, as many of you know, and there's no need to go through the history of Jonathan Mann, Sophia Gruskin, and so many others who were instrumental in making those links that were crucial and that became understood as well by Physicians for Human Rights. But in his very famous 1988 convention speech, which was Jackson said the following: "Common ground. America is not a blanket woven from one thread. One color, one cloth. When I was a child growing up in Greenville, South Carolina, my grandmama could not afford a blanket. She didn't complain and we did not freeze. Instead, she took pieces of an old cloth, patches, wool, sink, garbadine, cooker sack, only patches, barely good enough to wipe off your shoes with. But they didn't stay that way very long. With sturdy hands and a strong cord, she sewed them together into a quilt, a thing of beauty and power and culture. Now we must build such a quilt." He went on to talk about the patches that so many occupied, none big enough for their needs, whether farmers, workers, women, students, Blacks, Hispanics, gays, and lesbians, invoking their fight for fair price, fair wages, and comparable pay. And what he said to each is, your patch is not big enough. But he also said, don't despair, be as wise as my grandmama, pull the patches and the pieces together, bound by a common thread. When we form a great quilt of unity and common ground, we'll have the power to bring about healthcare and housing and jobs and education and hope to our nation. So the question for today is, can we not strengthen the threads that keep this quilt intact rather than tear at its very seams? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Krieger. And I want to follow your example and say that I am up the coast from you in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is also indigenous land, Mashpee Wampanoag land, threatened tribal land. When you asked, what is a government for? Is it to protect private wealth or create social programs? I thought how lucky we are to have my favorite economist on this panel, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, speaking after you. Professor Mazzucato is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London, where she is founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is the author of the highly acclaimed books, The Entrepreneurial State and The Value of Everything. Her work on economic transformations and the role of the state long predates COVID-19 and indeed has been fueled by it. Professor Mazzucato, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I think it'll be good, well, first of all, to turn on my timer, that's always good, to make sure that I don't repeat what's been said. But let me just say, I absolutely agree with lots of what's been said, especially about actually going to the source of the problem. Anytime we have a crisis, the idea that actually we need to immediately fix the system is very prevalent. And if we constantly are just fixing the system, the problem is that we literally go from one crisis to the next. And of course, that's exactly what we've been doing recently. We had very recently the financial crisis, which many countries are still trying to get over. In January and February, we weren't clapping healthcare workers, but flood workers in places like Venice, firefighters in places like California and Australia, and so on. And of course, now the health pandemic. So we really have this kind of interweaving three crises: economy, climate, health, but also many different structural crises around racism, around inequality that have already been mentioned. So what I want to do is the opposite of what Sandro did and just depress you a bit more. Sandro, when you were speaking, I thought that maybe you were Italian from your surname. So I thought I could open up by saying one Italian cheers you up, one Italian doesn't, but I see you're Canadian. Anyway, it doesn't work. We just
just for the record, I'm neither, I'm Maltese.
Fantastic. Okay, so it still doesn't work. Is someone's volume on? I'm hearing a lot of background there. But anyway, I'll go on. So first, I want to just be very clear on why we have to do everything we can to not go back to normal. And I just want to focus on some of what has not been said in terms of what was wrong with the normality and why the current then kind of positive recovery schemes that we need absolutely must structure within that recovery scheme specific and very concrete ways to actually tackle these problems that existed way pre-COVID. And just really quickly, I mean, just kind of looking at some of the key aspects of modern day capitalism. First of all, we have a financial sector which continues to finance itself. That has been one of the key causes of the crisis itself, where you have something like 80% of global finance just going back to finance, insurance, and real estate. So even just saying, hey, hold on, let's put this into the real economy and not into the financial sector is a big scream, but also making sure that once it does go into the real economy, it actually is directed towards things that actually make citizens' lives better. That, of course, is what we are talking about here. But we, still that first pillar of just to say, don't extract value, create it, that is still a very large problem. And that's also true in industry. And this is a second problem. We've been writing this for a long time, including as it sort of plagues large pharmaceutical companies, that the real economy itself, not just the financial sector, has been financialized. So the global Fortune 500 companies have spent over $4 trillion just in buying back their own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And that lack of reinvestment from the industrial community into, again, the real economy is partly, one of the key causes of inequality. Lots of people talk about the robots are taking our jobs. Well, actually, mechanization has been labor displacing for 200 years now. What's actually new is the corporate governance structures where these profits are being siphoned out of the system. And, I speak to businesses all the time. And when they say, why are you spending so much money, literally in the billions, often you hear the excuse, well, there's no, good opportunity for investment. And you hear this, by the way, by the largest share buybackers that are in the health sector and in the green economy, in the energy space. And so the fact that, we are speaking today about all these opportunities for investment in both the social and physical infrastructure underlying health, obviously is shows that there are those opportunities, but there's rewards right now, unfortunately, for those companies that are just pursuing these kind of short-term profits. And how to really tilt the playing field around that, away from that, is a key question. We're not going to change that just by leveling the playing field. Third, we really have a hollowed out state capacity. We absolutely have weak health systems in many parts of the world, weak public education, but what is even weaker is this notion of kind of, what is the state for? Is it simply there just to fix a market failure? If so, of course, we're going to go from crisis to crisis because we actually have to wait for markets to fail before even doing anything. And Nancy's point about actually, focusing public activity and governments around the social good, that requires a framing. And unfortunately, in economics, even the framing around the public good, it sounds good, good isn't the word, but the public good is just seen as a correction for a market failure around positive externalities. And negative externalities, you might, require carbon taxes to fix that problem, or information asymmetry, another market failure. So SMEs don't get enough funding, government might come in and fund them. But if you're just patching up bits of the system, as opposed to stepping back and actually actively co-creating and co-shaping markets and the economy towards the kind of goals that we have, for example, more inclusive growth, more sustainable growth, then it's going to be really hard to have those transitions if you're just constantly kind of too little, too late, putting different bandages in the system. And fourth, we have a huge crisis, and I already mentioned it, around climate change. But it's very large, and it's actually in many ways getting worse. So the IPCC have warned us now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that we only have 10 years left. But just last year, in 2019, subsidies to fossil fuel companies were estimated at about 20 billion a year in the US and over 50 billion a year in Europe. So we have a long way to go. Now, the problem is, just to make you a bit more depressed, COVID actually has the potential, and actually we're seeing this, to make a lot of these problems worse. Inequality, as has already been mentioned, has been rising. The levels of debt that we have out there, which very much were a cause of the crisis, so private debt, not public debt, caused the crisis, that's actually increasing right now because a lot of loans are being given out, but not paying attention to this inflation, this bubble of public debt that we have, but also of the COVID-19 recovery funding that has been allocated to energy companies. Some in the G20 countries, 56% has actually been given to fossil fuel projects, and that's over $150 billion. Anyway, so what do we do? Now, I want to use 4 words on how to make sure that we actually don't waste this crisis. I know it's a terrible term, but I think it's very important because we did waste the financial crisis. We simply bailed out the banks and also companies and didn't structure the recoveries to really build back better. So given that this word, building back better, is out there, what do we do? What does it actually mean to build back better in terms, for example, of how we structure public-private partnerships, in terms of how we direct the recovery funds in a way that actually really does build a more resilient, sustainable, inclusive economy? So the 4 words I want to talk about are directionality, stakeholder value, state capacity, and rethinking value itself as collectively created. So first of all, directionality. In the financial crisis, again, lots of money was thrown in. I already mentioned that a lot of it just went back into the financial sector. Currently, that's not actually happening, at least in the talk. In Europe, for example, the very large recovery program currently, for the first time since I've been alive, these European recoveries are actually conditional on governments having a strategy around climate, around health, and around digitalization. So this is a very positive change, at least here. And of course, in the US, again, 2 trillion going in, talking about, health, but is it actually going towards health? And there's been lots of critique about how that's not happening. But the second point around a stakeholder value approach to make sure that we actually, again, direct the funds not only in the right areas like public health, which of course needs to be funded globally. So global public health systems need to be financed, but a stakeholder value kind of way of structuring these recoveries, I think, is extremely important. So in places like Denmark, and I'm mainly focusing on examples, so it's not just about theory of what should happen, but shining the light on where there's some good examples. In Denmark, for example, the recovery funds are not going to companies that are using tax havens. In France, the recovery funds that went to the automobile sector and to the airline sector were conditional on those industries in those sectors actually reducing their carbon emissions. And actually in the US, one, again, positive light is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act, currently prohibits these funds being used for share buybacks. This, again, financialization problem that I mentioned in the beginning. But what does it then actually mean for how we govern the production of, for example, the vaccine, how we govern the production of the drugs for the therapies like remdesivir being put out by Gilead? Well, that very much needs to be in new types of public-private partnerships. And I think the World Health Organization has been absolutely right to pinpoint the issue around patents. We have really allowed patents and intellectual property rights in the health innovation process to be abused. So the fact that they're calling for a people's vaccine, where we actually govern a patent pool and share the knowledge. They talk about collective intelligence. That's absolutely central, but also making sure that the prices of the therapies, for example, actually reflect this immense amount of public spending that's going towards them. And it's interesting that Gilead is doing with remdesivir, which is a therapy for COVID, exactly what it did with the Hep C drug, which is charge exorbitant prices for drugs that are actually, again, to a large extent, also products of public funding. So that is obviously wrong. And really bringing to the debate today and using the COVID therapies and the COVID vaccine as a way to also think much more broadly around how to do health innovation with a stakeholder value perspective to really build symbiotic and mutualistic public-private partnerships, and not potentially the kind of parasitic ones we have seen in this sector. I've already talked too much. I'll just say quickly, state capacity is fundamental. It's fascinating to look at places like Kerala in India, but also Vietnam, These are developing countries, but that have done so much better than countries like where I'm sitting in the UK in terms of actually galvanizing the kind of real partnerships between academia, civil society, and the state in terms of the testing and actually strengthening the health system in such a difficult time. And that was partly also due to the investments that they've actually made in concrete structures, again, thinking about Sandro's word. And value, just to say, the word essential workers and key workers, we cannot let this word just slide away. This is such an important word. We are currently not valuing those same people that we're calling so essential. We don't know how to value healthcare workers in countries, for example, where you have a public healthcare system. Why? Because we confuse price with value. So in GDP, we only put the costs of the healthcare budget. We don't actually value the benefits that society receives from a properly well-funded public healthcare system. So we absolutely must make sure that this nice word, which is a great word, key workers and essential workers, turns into new accounting mechanisms as well, and new ways that we value that work, not only pay it better, but actually also account for it and how we measure our own well-being of our society.
Well, thank you very much, Mariana. And I'd like to just actually start by thanking all three panelists for sharing their really profoundly moving and insightful perspectives. And I know that I speak for everyone in saying that you've certainly given each of us so much to think about. And I'd like to just leap straight into questions and actually start, but I would like to encourage everyone to keep posting questions in the chat box. But we thought we'd actually start by throwing it back to the panelists and ask, is there actually something that you each particularly found quite striking from each other's presentations? Maybe start back with you, Mariana. If you were last, you go back first.
Sure. I mean, I definitely want us to go to the questions, so I'll be brief. When Nancy talked about the social good, it just, makes me think that it'd be very good if, economists, public health, people can actually come together and actually define what we mean by that. As I mentioned, we don't have a proper measure of the social good in the economy. And unfortunately, economics has a huge impact on what actually happens on the ground in the policymaking space. So I really want to elevate that word up that she mentioned and ask that we together also, almost as a movement, really take that word seriously and redefine it away from this very narrow way that it's been conceptualized. And I thought Sandro's quote from Martin Luther King was so important in terms of we actually need to change the structures that cause the poverty and the inequalities and the racism in the first place. And that to me seems like, again, a call for rethinking how you deal with inequality, not just in terms of redistribution, but that kind of pre-distribution lens where we need new structures and new contracts.
I'll just follow to say that I think the thing that stands out from the two different presentations is there's actually a belief that government can do something for the good, but that depends on who's running the government. And I think that that really calls for understanding that who do governments need to stand for? What does that really mean? I mean, there are obviously governments that don't stand for the people and are autocratic and abusive in all kinds of ways. And that's a acute concern of Physicians for Human Rights. So it's no simple notion that government is good. It's not necessarily, but also the other thing that stands out is that governments can act. And I think COVID has shown us, and these comments come to play and what has been said, is that governments had to act and acted decisively and quickly and showed that they have the levers of power. Yes, there is enormous corporate power in this world, but governments still really were able to act. And that was also necessitated not simply because health was seen as an important issue, but because people crashing out hospitals and health systems was incompatible with society's functioning.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, I think we're each of us speaking obviously from our own just disciplinary lens, but I think from our own perspectives, biases, and prior thoughts. But I thought there were quite a few real commonalities in what we said, and I think the thread of the importance of having community engagement to tie in these notions together, to have deeply involved communities. I think that ties in with the notion I was pushing around change in the conversation. Conversation happens among all of us, and we as communities. That's number one. I think the other thread that emerged from what all three of us said was that ultimately none of it matters unless we change structures. And I thought the third point, just to echo Professor Krieger's last point, and I think Professor Matsukato had a similar point, is if we talk about the role of government, implicit in that is accountability, because government is really the only branch of societal functioning that is ultimately comes from the people and which ostensibly role is to respond to the people, which is a level of accountability that obviously private sector does not have. I think Professor Krieger's point about the fact that of course depends on who's in government, that's a very valid point. But fundamentally, I wonder how much we can take from that about our collective accountability to realize the potential of the moment. So I just want to put the word accountability into our space.
Maybe I can build on that, and the collective part of the collective accountability. We had a question inspired by Professor Krieger's comments about whether and how it's possible to strengthen and grow the threads of connection that you talked about in a world that is, according to this questioner, dominated by tech companies and where community is threatened by individualism. And this person seems to be suggesting that in addition to challenging structures and narratives, as you said, Professor Galea, there's something about the way we relate to each other and the very social fabric that stands in the way of transformation.
I mean, I'll just say something quickly because I know both other panelists have much to say on this as well. We live simultaneously at multiple levels. That's also the nature of our existence as life. We are individuals, we are members of communities, we are members of societies, we are members of nations, we are members of the world. However, we don't have equal power at all levels. And while all levels matter and interconnected, yes, people need to act better towards each other individually, but both other speakers were also emphasizing the need to change the structures which change and shape the nature of the interactions that people have. Arrows flow in both directions of action and also accountability, but not with equal force. And so I think it's very important to understand how we relate as individuals with each other. But what really I think is being asked for in this moment is how many different social movements come to understand what the connections are. There's been a tendency to have movements also function in more siloed ways, just like you can have siloed disciplines in public health and in many other different fields. Our bodies demand something different, as does health justice. And so for me, it's been incredibly encouraging seeing again different movements, seeing the environmental movement starting to take on racial justice this past summer, for example, in ways that you would not have seen before, and understanding that you cannot move forward on climate justice if you don't deal with environmental racism and make what those connections are. So I think where gender justice fits into all of this as well. So I think that the connecting across the different social movements, the understanding that you have to stand up for what you need to stand up for, but you do that with others and understand the connections. And that for me was always the very important appeal of the initial framing of the Rainbow Coalition that first got me very engaged in public health, was that each stripe is doing its thing, but together they make the rainbow.
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that, to Jonathan, to your question and building on Professor Krieger's point. And this echoes something that I sort of said at the beginning. In some respects, COVID did not teach us anything we did not know. I actually think it's important to say that, and I think it emerged from both the other speakers as well. People have been writing about this and commenting on this for decades and centuries. So then COVID hits us now because it's made these things clear. But in some respects, the structural elements that were unacceptable before COVID, we're now realizing are unacceptable. So it does present a unique moment. For example, we've talked quite a bit appropriately in the US about the vastly disproportionate number of Black Americans who are dying from COVID. Well, there was a recent paper just came out in Proceeding the National Academy of Sciences that showed that certainly the COVID Black-white gap pales in comparison with the underlying Black-white gap in health and in premature mortality that there is in the United States. That has nothing to do with COVID, that existed for years before COVID. So what I think the moment is casting a lens on what we've already known And I think it is then on us to make sure that we no longer accept these structures or accept a conversation that says that the status quo is okay. And to Professor Krieger's point, changing the conversation is a lot of work, and it requires, and Professor Krieger has used the word coalitions that are beyond anything that we have achieved so far. So I would like to cling to hope, to extend the rainbow metaphor. I'd like to cling to the hope that there will be light at the end of a dark tunnel.
I'd like to actually
just add some
on the data on premature mortality, though. I don't think that's correct. We have a working paper that's out that's showing, and this is back to the point about the essential workers, among working age adults, if you look at the age-specific mortality, racial, ethnic inequities, they're on the order of 5 to 10-fold in death for COVID mortality rates. That 5 to 10-fold death rate, excessive death rate, comparing Black, Latinx, American Indian to white non-Hispanic, dwarfs by a lot premature mortality for chronic conditions. Usually those mortality rates, those rate ratios on the order of 2 or so at most. And the reason that that's important is that a lot of people have been trying to say, oh, all the excess mortality is due to pre-existing conditions. And the pre-existing conditions and also difference, you mean the US body mass index obesity, it does matter. But there's this excessive mortality happening and also happening in a really fast time that is absolutely destroying people's families, what's going on for the kids, the multi-generational impacts that make something new happening here in the ways that these inequitable deaths are occurring, particularly at younger ages.
In defense of the paper was published, and I didn't want to misquote it. It was talking about absolute deaths, not relative deaths. So I think your point is correct.
Mariana, did you want to come in before May asks the next question?
Just really quickly about the citizen engagement issue. I think it's huge. I mean, it's already been mentioned that, you know, with the climate change battle, you know, the students, for example, in schools all over the world have been striking, and, you know, there's a movement for that. And I think what's really interesting is, you know, how can we think about social movements, not just, again, in terms of protest, but actually in terms of that directionality that I was talking about before. You know, we wouldn't have weekends. We wouldn't have weekends or the 8-hour workday without the labor movement. You know, people fought for that, as well as, you know, many other things. We wouldn't have the AIDS drugs without the ACT UP movement. We wouldn't have birth control without the feminist movement. So how can we actually really rethink what it even means to build a movement to actually, again, structure and redirect fundamentally our economies and society in different ways? And on this point, I think that the health area is fascinating, because for too long within health, there's been two completely separate conversations. One is around the innovation, entrepreneurship, and, you know, the R&D and all the kind of investment that has to occur for the drugs or vaccines or for other, you know, parts of the system. And the other side is on care, health care, right? And that's really about the welfare state in many ways, at least for countries that have any welfare state. Unfortunately, in many countries, there isn't any level of public health still. But if we just think about the discussion about care, how can we bring these two different conversations, not only together, but have the movements, right, redefine what kind of care do we even want, and hence what kind of innovation, how to govern that innovation to get that kind of care. Currently, the fact that they're so separate has also, if you want, nurtured this very problematic way that we just think of, you know, a race towards something, just spend a lot of money on something without really thinking about that very important topic that, again, Nancy mentioned, which is the social good or the common good. The Vatican talks about it as the common home. I'm not religious. And so I do think these two issues of how do we bring movements to the fore, to actually bring new voices, to even define what are we even trying to do, including, by the way, with the climate change issue, you know, who's actually defining what we mean by a carbon neutral city or sustainable city? How do we really bring citizens to that project, but definitely in this healthcare space? And also, again, how do we bring together the welfare state and the innovation state conversations so that one becomes almost a funnel of the other, but then we have to ask what is, you know, wealth, you know, what do we mean by welfare and well-being?
Anna. These are really, really important answers and really insightful. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm actually going to attempt to actually combine two what I think are quite important questions, but I don't mean to belittle them by trying to combine them here. And I think we've heard a lot about structures and framing and changing of the conversation. And what needs to change and how do we do that? And so one of the questions was talking about, so we've heard a lot about, the race as being a factor of health vulnerability. One of the questions is about, do we need to change that more around framing of it as an actual, is racism a public health crisis? Is it about reframing a lot of what we're talking about? And then the other question is a bit of a leap, but it's also talking about structures and what needs to happen. They were asking about, to actually make a lot of this happen, do we need to completely dismantle our global level structures and rethink capitalism and the hierarchy of power of nations, or not? Can we work with it, or does it need to go? Do we need something completely different? I know that's a lot to throw in there, but any quick thoughts towards the end?
I'll jump in very quickly. One, I think it's absolutely crucial to frame things in terms of racism being a public health crisis. It's a crisis for a lot else too, for education, transportation, housing, and you can sort of name the issue, but this gets back to how it is all cited and again, gets embodied and integrated in all these different ways. And the importance of doing that is understanding that racism has, among other things, health impacts, biological impacts, which is totally different than framing race as about quote unquote biology. So I think it's really important to have that framing and then to start to think about how that provides a platform for talking about the kinds of approaches that need to be multifaceted, understanding again that different people in different sectors will be doing their different parts of the work, but understand what the commonalities are. Secondly, there have been long debates about what needs to replace, what could potentially replace capitalism. As I said, the 1840s were the cutting edge of public health. And that was also the beginnings of, 1848 is a year also known for the Communist Manifesto and much else, with the revolutions that were going on, saying that you needed to have a political class represent the majority of the peoples and have actually economic as well as political democracy. There have been things that have been done in the names of systems that are not capitalism that have been heinous for human rights as well. So the question of how you have human rights democracy and some versions of economic democracy have yet to be sorted. And I think it's also very important in the US context that you can see a lot that's discussed about quote unquote capitalism, not differentiating that, Anglo-Saxon capitalism and the racial capitalism that is here is somewhat different, for example, than what you may see as a Nordic model, which is also a form of capitalism. So I think it's really important to be more precise in figuring out what the transformation is, but leading by putting forward what the values are and what the values are in representing economic democracy and human rights.
Do any of our, we have just 2 minutes left. This whole question of racism as a public health crisis and what replaces our economic system, it's such a powerful set of ideas to end on. Perhaps the value of it is precisely the opportunity to end with questions. We are at the bottom of the hour. So perhaps I will thank you all and turn it over to Donna McKay to conclude the session out of respect for everyone's time.
Jonathan, thank you. I could have listened to this conversation for many more hours. It was incredible. Thank you, and May, for putting together this truly outstanding conversation today. And also I want to thank the panelists for sharing your wisdom and also for inspiring us. As I mentioned at the opening, I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, just the opportunity to hear from such luminaries in a conversation with one another. And it raised so many threads for us to pull at, as you referred to, Professor Krieger. And for those of us who listen to it today, I think we'll be doing just that for a very long time as a result of your critical perspectives. I hope you will consider coming back as this situation and our work evolves, and we can take stock of how we're leaning into this crisis and finding those transformational moments when change can occur. There's just so much from today's conversation. We will publish this Zoom which can be found on our website later today. And I'd love to encourage those of you who listened to share the video with those people who are in positions to act or are interested in learning. Our webinar series is providing experts and advocates a platform to share their important perspectives, and we're going to continue to do so. So we hope you'll join for future conversations, but you can sign up for notifications at PHR's website. Next week, we will produce a two-part series focusing on the path to the delivery of COVID-19 vaccine, which will be moderated by Nina Schwably of Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. So just to close by thanking you so very, very much for this inspiration and for giving so generously of your time today for this discussion. So be well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks very much.